Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker, Bob Lackey. Dr. Lackey will address us on the role of science in decision-making and policy in fisheries management. Dr. Lackey is a professor of fisheries and an adjunct professor of political science at Oregon State University. He retired from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 2008. After 3 decades of federal service, during which he served in many leadership positions, maybe I should repeat that, he retired in 2008 after 3 decades of federal service, during which he served in many leadership positions. He was awarded by EPA its highest honor, the Gold Medal, and that is given for exceptional contributions in strengthening the role of science in ecological policy. Dr. Lackey has authored over 120 journal articles and book chapters. He is really well known for his thought-provoking and insightful articles about the interaction of science, management, and policy. Dr. Lackey was also on the faculty at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University early in his career. And he had one graduate student that I know quite well. Bob was my major advisor for my PhD, and I'm indebted to him for serving in that capacity. The title of his talk is Science, Beacon of Reality. Let's join together in welcoming Bob Lackey.
Thank you, Wayne. I am delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to address the 141st annual meeting of the American Fisheries Society. Delighted in part because I've been fortunate enough to attend most of the AFS plenary sessions for the past 40 years. And during every one of those sessions, sitting out there just like you are now, I've often wondered exactly how are these plenary speakers selected? What's the formula? How does it happen? Now I know. Here's the inside story. Someone from the AFS leadership calls. He begins the conversation by praising whatever good can be found about your professional record, and then eventually asks, "Hey, Bob, want to give a plenary talk at the next AFS meeting? The program committee has decided to have a respected local politician, an esteemed educator, a veteran policy advocate, but we also want someone who isn't afraid to pry us out of our professional comfort zone, someone to place our work in a larger context, someone to provoke us a bit. I'm hoping that you would be willing to serve in that role." So, what could I say? I am here today, the designated provocateur in today's lineup. However it happened, I am delighted to take up the challenge and address this year's theme, New Frontiers in Fisheries Management and Ecology, Leading the Way in a Changing World. New frontiers, changing world, leading the way. These words have the ring of a political speech. A political speech. I'll confess up front that giving political speeches is not my strong suit. In fact, I have approximately zero tolerance for the twaddle that so often passes for political discourse. But I will assume that being the designated provocateur means that no one expects me to pander for votes by treating you as if you were an adolescent who would only respond to a feel-good message presented as a campfire sing-along. If you're expecting this, be prepared to be disappointed. Let's get to the task, addressing the theme of this meeting. I'll start with the changing world part. Where have we been and where are we heading? My first serious jolt about the changing world part happened 40 years ago this month, when I was a young assistant professor at Virginia Tech. Like many newly minted PhDs, I was enamored with the latest and greatest scientific and technical developments. I was convinced, with just a few more decades of scientific progress, and of course with more grant money, convinced that we fisheries scientists could solve most of the remaining challenges in fisheries management. To me, our profession was mostly about collecting more data, embracing the latest improvements in technology, and developing ever more elegant computer models. Exciting times for a young technocrat. My professional naivete was abruptly demolished at one of these AFS annual meetings. I was sitting next to one of the giants in our profession listening to technical talks. He is someone you all know, at least by name. When the last speaker finished, he leaned over and lamented, "Bob, you know the thing that disappoints me most here," and here he was referring to the technical presenters, "is that the majority of these folks are focused on yesterday's problems. They don't even realize that a changing world has made most of what they're doing essentially irrelevant." I well remember his words, and they had an effect. Here I am, 40 years later, and I still fret about his prediction. He turned out to be right. I did see our profession change, and change dramatically. As one of my long-term colleagues regularly reminds me, "Bob, over my 4-decade career, the fisheries issues that I once worked on have moved. They've moved either from the sports page to the front page, or they have disappeared entirely from the newspaper." I've also observed these changes. In 1964, when I worked for the California Department of Fish and Game, I read Field and Stream to keep abreast of what was happening professionally, to keep professionally relevant. Now I read The Economist. Where once the first day of trout season was practically a public holiday, now the first day of trout season passes without even a mention on the sports page, and certainly not the front page. Wait just a few years. As soon as the last newspaper ceases publication, our younger colleagues won't even know what a front page is. Sure, agencies still set creel limits for Mud Pond and Clear Creek. Necessary stuff, but not likely to make much difference to anyone except a few fishing diehards and agency administrators who see their budgets eroding as demographics shift. Now, we decide whether a particular run of salmon will fall under the bureaucratic tentacles of the Endangered Species Act, a decision that can affect the lives of millions of people, define the careers of thousands of biologists, and, as well, provide economic sustenance to hordes of lawyers. But today's so-called important fisheries issues need to be placed in the grand scheme of a changing world. Let's consider our profession and our priorities in this changing world. Imagine that you are sitting in the audience of that very first AFS annual meeting, New York City, 1870, just 141 years ago. Listening to those plenary talks, you are well aware that the European states are globally dominant, both economically and politically. The United States is still recovering from a nasty internal war, the consequence of half the states seceding from the Union and forming their own independent nation. Secession worked once in 1776, but not a second time in 1861. So there you are, listening to those talks, a fisheries professional in 1870, 5 years after the end of the Civil War. It is a world so different that it can scarcely be imagined today. To illustrate, let me add a bit more economic and political context. As an attendee of that 1870 meeting, you know that the once again reunited United States is not in the top tier of nations. At best, it is towards the lower end of the second tier. The BRICS, B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they are not factors in your economic or political worldview in 1870. The realities of the time. But things change, and these changes affect society and our profession. Back to the future, 141 years later, to 2011, to Seattle. You're still a fisheries scientist, still listening to plenary talks. But the European states, with the possible exception of Germany, are in decline. The PIGS, that's P-I-I-G-S, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, these 5 countries are functionally bankrupt. Time magazine's story last week captured it all with the headline, "The Decline and Fall of Europe." Before you get too smug, remember that the United States is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and worse, the U.S. has yet to demonstrate much appetite for the difficult and painful choices needed to reverse this downward spiral. And remember those BRICS. They were lost in the economic backwater at the time of the first AFS meeting in 1870. Today, Brazil has a booming economy and sits atop one of the world's great untapped oil deposits. Russia now pumps more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia and has gained international prominence as a political and economic force. India, boasting the largest middle class in the world, awards more college degrees than the United States. And China, if it maintains its current economic growth rate, will be the largest economy in the world by the end of this decade. In a span of 141 years, the international order has turned upside down. Dream on if you think this change hasn't fundamentally altered our profession. Okay, we can easily see the changes that have taken place, but what's coming? More change. Let me use an example of the kind of change we should expect and how this change will affect the context of our work. The population of the United States has now topped 310 million. By 2100, just 89 years down the road, expect it to hit 500 million, 500 million people. And don't forget to add in 50 million more Canadians expected in 2100. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, what demographers call fill-in country with its exceptionally rapid population growth rate, we now have roughly 15 million people. Think about the Pacific Northwest in 2100. Think about the human population in these 3 states and 1 province. Not 15 million as we have today, but 50 to 100 million. Imagine a quadrupling, a quintupling of the human population of the Pacific Northwest by 2100. When faced with such population trajectories, many fisheries professionals buckle. Even some of us tell it like it is scientists fold and end up grasping for intellectual life rafts by mumbling something like, "The future is too difficult to predict," or perhaps, "I choose to remain optimistic about the future." Such responses are nothing more than denying simple facts by clutching delusional reality and wrapping it in a cloak of personal virtue. For fisheries professionals, especially for scientists, be fearlessly realistic. No to pessimism, no to optimism, yes to realism. Just cold, unblinking, honest information upon which society and policymakers must make choices. As the late Senator Daniel Moynihan said, surely thinking about fisheries professionals, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but he is not entitled to his own set of facts. Okay, let's practice some of this realism. A little test drive for each of you. Look outside your hotel window tonight and imagine the Pacific Northwest in 2100. Contemplate the demand, the future demand for houses, apartments, hotels, schools, tennis courts, football stadiums, roads, airplanes, trains, Walmarts, electricity, drinking water, natural gas pipelines, lithium for electric car batteries, McDonald's, Starbucks. And for the Canadians out there, feel free to add in Tim Hortons to my list. It will be a long, long list. You can fill in the consequent effects on aquatic environments and everything else. Think European population densities. I can almost hear the groans and moans out there, a yearning for the good old days. Tell me, would the good old days be the first AFS meeting in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War, where we lost more soldiers than any war in the U.S. history? Or perhaps the decade following the 1929 stock market crash, where the overall economic conditions were still as bad in 1939 as they were in 1929. Pick any era you want. Face it, there are no good old days, there are simply old days. The same goes for the future. Now let me move to the other part of this year's theme, leadership. Most of us think of policy leadership as coming from an energetic politician or perhaps an enlightened government bureaucrat. We usually do not think of policy leadership as coming from scientists, but the public should expect policy leadership to come from scientists. But I don't mean dazzling breakthroughs in genetics, ever more elegant population dynamic models, or the razzle-dazzle, knock-your-socks-off GIS technology that we see so common these days. I'm talking about a different kind of policy leadership that we should expect from scientists. I look at it as leading from behind. Let me elaborate. Many of you have jobs where you are expected to provide relevant, accurate, timely, and unbiased science to inform the public and decision makers. For much of my career, I've also had such a job. And I know that a good many of you are fisheries managers or decision makers who use science along with many other inputs to make choices. I have great respect for managers and decision makers because they must take science along with all the other inputs that go into the political process and make a decision. Science is important to them, but is only one of many inputs. As with policymakers of all types, managers and decision makers are, in effect, picking winners and losers. Still others of you are policy advocates, pushing a particular policy preference. You may be advancing a preference to preserve wild salmon runs, to develop ocean wave energy, to abolish all forms of whaling, to increase domestic oil production, or any of 1,000 other preferences. Advocacy is legitimate, in a democracy at least, even though many scientists disparage it. And policy advocates are free to use whatever tactics will work to advance their policy preferences. And they do. But scientists are neither decision makers nor policy advocates. Scientists have a different role, a critical and essential one. Let me illustrate. The Constitution of the American Fisheries Society states that its purpose is to promote the conservation, development, and wise use of the fisheries. But the meaning of these words have no inherent definition in science. Ultimately, it is society at large that judges what is really meant by these words. Think about the practical meaning of conservation, development, and wise use, given the daily demands of those 500 million people who will be living in the United States in 2100. Okay, where does that leave scientists? It is, and it will continue to be, absolutely essential that scientists help society and decision makers, help them understand difficult policy trade-offs But exactly how should scientists help? Welcome to the world of politics. Surprisingly, at least for me, I have found it to be a place of excitement and challenge. Exciting and challenging, yes, but often downright scary. To be truthful, I have also found the policy and political world to be a landscape populated by delusional bureaucratic cheerleaders, overrun with feel-good politicians, and infested with very well-funded policy advocates, all of whom will use science and some scientists to advance their political agenda. Nevertheless, as scary as it may be to most scientists, the policy world is also a place where scientists can and should contribute. But for scientists who take their role, their civic responsibility seriously, all is not well. Far from it. Specifically, for scientists at least, advocating personal or organizational policy preferences has become widely tolerated as acceptable professional behavior. Scientists may even be encouraged to do this by a portion of our professional community. The risk? We will diminish ourselves and the scientific enterprise when we allow personal and organizational policy preferences to color our scientific contributions. This is a morass into which scientists must not allow ourselves to slip. As scientists, we have a special role, an exclusive role, because we are uniquely qualified to provide technical knowledge that is based on rigorous scientific principles. It is this policy-neutral knowledge that the public and decision makers sorely need. Is the scientific enterprise at risk? It is. A recent U.S. national poll revealed that 40% of the general public has little or no trust in what scientists say about environmental issues. And about as bad, the remaining 60% were not all that positive either. I suspect that similar results will be found in Canada, especially for fisheries science. How pervasive is this distrust? I have a good friend who has worked for several big national environmental organizations. When I shared with him some of the ideas that I was thinking about presenting today, he stopped me cold with a blunt reality check. Bob, you've got to move into the 21st century. Science is a weapon in the policy wars. We, and by we he meant his large and well-funded NGO, we buy the most believable scientists we can find and send them into court to do battle with government scientists. Eventually, the judge gets overwhelmed by the minutiae and orders the parties to go away, work out some kind of a compromise. This is how it works now. When this happens, we, his organization, we nearly always win because the agency just wants to make the case go away. And best of all, they usually agree to pay our legal costs. That's the real world, my friend. What did I say to deserve this rant? But he was more upfront than most policy advocates. And I'll accept that his is a sound political strategy for an advocacy group, but it is still a corruption of science and a scientific enterprise. He is paid to understand and manipulate the political and legal system to achieve his organization's goals, but it is still a corruption of science. What role should scientists play in policy debates? How can they best provide leadership? How does a scientist lead from behind? First, scientists should contribute to and inform political deliberations. This is not only the right thing to do, but we have an obligation, especially if our work is publicly funded. I do not hold with the notion that it is sufficient for fisheries scientists to publish their findings in scholarly papers that only a few technical experts will ever read. I take it as a given that scientists should also provide and explain the underlying science, including uncertainty, around important policy questions. Second, When scientists do contribute to policy analysis and implementation, and they should, they must exercise great care to play an appropriate role. Unfortunately, working at this interface is also where some scientists mislead or confuse decision makers by letting their personal policy preferences color their science. It is so easy to do. Let me share a slightly embarrassing story that demonstrates one consequence of allowing policy preferences to infect science. It involves a veteran government lawyer, someone I've worked with for many years. We were relaxing in a Portland pub after spending a long day listening to scientists dueling over the science regarding an Endangered Species Act issue. I was trying to convince him, the lawyer, from my perspective as a scientist, that it seemed reasonable that the opposing litigants could at least be able to agree on the basic science relevant to the particular court case, the so-called scientific facts of the case. After all, the legal debate should be over interpretations of the law, not science, right? Perhaps I was badgering him a bit too much, but his response to my pestering sobered me. Bob, and I've also learned this too, you know, whenever people start a statement with your first name, you know you're going to get beat on. Bob, condescendingly, Bob, you guys, and by this he meant scientists generally, you guys have no credibility. All of you spin your science to lend support to whatever policy outcome you or your organization wants. I'm not sure science was ever a beacon of truth, but it sure is not now, at least in the legal arena. I watch scientists routinely misuse science in case after case. No credibility, science spin, misuse of science. He was wrong, wasn't he? No, he was not entirely wrong. Let me offer an example. The most common misuse of science is to assume a policy preference and then incorporate that policy preference into scientific information. Now, political scientists will call that science normative science. And normative science is, unfortunately, increasingly common. Let me be unequivocal here. Using normative science is stealth policy advocacy, plain and simple. Ignorance is no excuse. Who would do such a thing? It happens, and it happens often. An example from this part of North America, the case of the 160-year decline of wild salmon and the role of dams. Here's a big insight. Dams have an effect on wild salmon populations, and the effect is negative. It took us 160 years to figure this out. Along the West Coast, it is common for scientists to be asked to gauge the likely effects on wild salmon of removing a particular dam or building a particular dam for that matter. This is a legitimate and appropriate role for scientists and one that we are well positioned to play. But there is no scientific imperative to remove or build dams. Policy imperatives come from people's values and priorities, not from science. All of the policy options regarding the future of dams have ecological consequences, some of which may even be catastrophic from a salmon perspective. But ecological consequences are simply one element that the public and decision makers must weigh in choosing from a set of typically unpleasant alternatives. Hardly a week passes that I don't receive an online petition from an advocacy group asking me and other scientists to sign as a show of support to remove a particular salmon-killing dam for reasons that sound like science, read like science, are presented by people who cloak themselves in the accoutrements of science, but who are actually offering nothing but policy advocacy masquerading as science. Scientists, acting in a role as policy-neutral providers of information, should not decide whether it's more important to use water to sustain wild salmon, or the same water to generate electricity to run air conditioners, or the same water to irrigate alfalfa fields, or the same water to make artificial snow at your favorite ski resort. Politically, from what I observe today, the use of normative science cuts across the ideological spectrum. It seems no less common coming from the political left or the political right, from the Greens or the Libertarians, or from government agencies or private sector organizations. Regardless of the political ideology, normative science is a corruption of science. No matter how strongly a scientist feels about his or her policy preferences, practicing normative science is not okay, no exceptions. Let me conclude with a few words about the new frontiers that we should anticipate in the coming decades. First, as the theme of this meeting implies, there will be change. Dramatic social, political, and environmental change. Don't be surprised. Don't be overwhelmed. You will be confronted with new frontiers. Expect them, prepare for them. Second, decision makers, fisheries managers, and the general public will continue to need cold, hard scientific facts, including uncertainties, provided from sources they trust. If you want to be an effective scientist, become that trusted source. When it comes to science, I say, shun pessimism, reject optimism, embrace realism. Regardless of the change that you are confronted with, whatever new frontiers might appear unexpectedly, science must be the facts upon which decisions are made. Scientists can provide leadership, but that leadership comes from behind. Tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing more, nothing less. However uncomfortable, however unpleasant, however unappreciated it may be to those of us who are scientists, science can be and should be a beacon of reality in a changing and uncertain world. For scientists, be that beacon. Thank you.